Hello, everybody, and welcome to Bible Actually. My name is Seamus, and let's just jump right into today's topic, Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13. That's right, folks, we're talking about the term New Covenant, and really Old Covenant also by proxy, I guess. Now, with this particular verse, there's a lot of common misconceptions about what's being talked about here, so today I plan to go over a lot of clarifying points on what's going on in the mind of the writer of the book of Hebrews, what he's talking about, pulling it together in context, and why the typical normative Christian explanation of this verse doesn't make sense when you consider everything together. So, this is part of a new show we're doing called Bible Actually. Basically, what that means is we're going to go over what the Bible actually says, both linguistically and interpretively. What does the Bible actually say there? What does it really say? What is the language? What does the Bible actually say theologically? What is it talking about? What is the context in which it is bringing these topics up and giving certain answers? What is the interpretation that would have been known or the plain meaning of the text to the receiver of the text? Because remember, most of these are letters written from one person to another. What does the Bible actually say? Well, we intend to go over many of those topics here on the show. So without further ado, let's talk about Hebrews 8 and the New Covenant, and also the problematic phrase Old Covenant. But before we jump right into the verse in question, we have a lot of preliminary information we got to go over. First and foremost, how translations kind of are meant to work. Many people today are unaware of exactly how much interpretation goes into a Bible translation. There's a reason that there are dozens of different English translations. Now, by and large, these translations are attempting to be as true to the text as possible. The problem is, how do you accomplish this while remaining true to the text? Now, you might say the most obvious first choice would be the word-for-word translation, and some translators do prefer to take this approach. They try to stay as literal as possible, opting for a more word-for-word, one-to-one translation, but an actual word-for-word translation is not possible. Nevertheless, that's the goal. Other translations try instead to convey the meaning of the text, doing so in maybe a more modern vernacular, something we'd be more familiar with. That way, we will come away to understand how the text was meant to be understood to the reader. This is usually called a thought-for-thought translation. The downside to this is that the translator has done all of the exegetical work for you, and that means you have to trust his interpretation. You also sacrifice the word-for-word translation's biggest positive, which is being able to actually look up the words that they decided to translate that way and do some of the research on your own. So now what does that have to do with Hebrews 8, chapter 13? Well, actually quite a lot. Just about every major Christian translation of Hebrews 8:13, whether it's word for word or thought for thought, has inserted a word for you that isn't there in the text. In other words, both styles have chosen to interpret the meaning on your behalf, whether you knew that or not, and whether you realized that or not. For example, the ESV reads, "In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away." Now, the word in question is covenant. In fact, the same is true of Hebrews 8, verse 7. Covenant is not in the text. Now, it is present in verse 6, diathekes, and it's also present in the Jeremiah quotation from verses 8 through 12. So if that's the case, then the obvious lack of the use of the word covenant in verse 13 doesn't really matter. Context would dictate that it should be covenant, right? Well, not so fast. This would only be true if Hebrews 8 verses 7 through 13 were existing in a vacuum. The reality is, however, that this is existing in a much larger part of the conversation in the context of the letter to the Hebrews. So here's my goal for today's show. While exploring the contextual arguments of Hebrews 8:13, I will demonstrate that the word covenant is at best misleading and provide an interpretation of Hebrews 8 based on all of the available evidence from the text itself and, where it is relevant, any historical evidence as well. I intend to show you my entire thought process as we get there. Now, in order to gain a full picture of the verse in question, we should go all the way back to the beginning when the topic is first brought up. If we venture back to the first few verses of chapter 8, we can find that we're talking about Jesus, Yeshua, as being a high priest. The ESV reads, "Now the point in what we are saying is this: we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. Now, this is the ending part of a much larger discussion which began all the way back in chapter 4 about the office of the high priest. The idea is to compare the current earthly priesthood to the superiority of Yeshua's high priesthood in heaven. But now we have a problem. Yeshua is the line of David from the tribe of Judah. Well, this means that according to Torah, he's not allowed to be a priest. Only Aaron and his sons can become high priests. And this is called the Aaronic covenant, because God explicitly made a covenant with Aaron and his sons forever, that Aaron and his lineage would forever inherit the high priesthood. The Torah itself speaks of this covenant as being an eternal covenant. Numbers 18 verse 8, for example, reads, "Then the Lord spoke to Aaron, 'Look, I have put you in charge of the contributions brought to me. As for all the holy offerings of the Israelites, I have given them to you and your sons as a portion and a permanent statute.'" There is no getting around this. God made a promise to the Levitical tribe, a permanent one at that. And unless we think God is a liar who's prone to change his mind, or who doesn't keep his promises, then Yeshua can simply never replace the Aaronic priesthood. If he did, this would be an open violation of the Torah, and that would therefore disqualify him from being Messiah at all. In fact, Hebrews 8 makes this very argument. Verse 4 reads, "Now if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law." This is why the writer of Hebrews specifies Yeshua's priesthood as being of the line of Melchizedek. This is a completely different priesthood altogether. And I think it's worth noting here that the priesthood of Melchizedek can't replace the Aaronic priesthood either. In fact, Hebrews 7 makes this very clear as well. And this is why the writer brings up that Melchizedek doesn't appear to have any lineage mentioned in the Torah. The writer of Hebrews seems to be making the case that because Melchizedek's lineage is made no mention of in the Torah, well then his authority, his lineage, quote unquote, comes from heaven. That this inheritance doesn't need to be of a lineage in the human way. This shows that the inheritance of this priesthood comes from heaven. Hebrews is attempting to draw a parallel here by inferring that Yeshua also received his priesthood inheritance from heaven, just like Melchizedek did. It is therefore a heavenly priesthood and not an earthly one. So, if that's the case, how are we supposed to understand Hebrews 7 verse 18? For on the one hand, a former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness. Does this not mean to say that the former Aaronic priesthood has been set aside? Well, as we like to say in Hebrew, chas v'shalom, heaven forbid. In Tim Hegg's commentary on this verse in Hebrews, he writes, "Those laws given in the Torah to regulate and define the priestly service upon the earth do not apply to the priestly service of Yeshua in heaven." Now, Tim Hegg actually spends a lot of time on this verse, but I'll simplify it for you. In other words, the rules and regulations governing the heavenly temple's priesthood and its aspects are slightly different, chiefly in the way of inheritance and lineage. The earthly temple was always meant to be a shadow of the heavenly temple. Therefore, in most ways, the laws for the heavenly temple and the earthly temple are going to be nearly exactly the same. However, because the jurisdiction of the heavenly temple is different, and we are making a direct comparison to the earthly temple, then we have to set aside the commandment for the Aaronic inheritance, because in this context, that particular set of laws is useless. It's a law that only governs the earthly temple, and so it has no application in the heavenly temple. The primary concern here in Hebrews chapter 7 is the priesthood. Now, keeping that context in mind, it doesn't seem to make any sense that the writer of Hebrews would suddenly shift to making an argument that the Torah is completely done away with in the middle of this entire argument, because we see that the Torah is being used as the foundation for this entire argument. Just like me interjecting right now to tell you to bless that like button and believe in the subscribe button if you haven't already. The writer of Hebrews, in fact, affirms the Torah's current and active authority in verse 4 of chapter 8. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all. Notice now we have entered the beginning of Hebrews chapter 8, and we're still talking about the priesthood. Verses 1 through 5 very clearly makes this case. We're clearly speaking about the priesthood and how the heavenly priesthood is superior, although not a replacement for, the earthly priesthood. Now, the point in what we are saying is this: we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus, it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now, if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things, For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown to you on the mountain." Now, let's read verse 6 with everything we've talked about in mind. "But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry, to the extent that he is also the mediator of a better covenant, which has been enacted on better promises." Now, we've already acknowledged that the word covenant is in fact present in this verse, but keeping in mind everything that we've just talked about leading up to this verse, what covenant are we talking about? The Mosaic covenant? No mention of the Mosaic covenant has yet to appear. It would be strange for it to suddenly appear now, right in the middle of our heavenly priesthood discussion. I propose that the covenant which Yeshua has obtained that is better is the priesthood covenant. So allow me to offer an amplified version of Hebrews 8. Now, in this amplified translation, I am also going to include how some of these words can have other meanings, because again, we're going to talk about what the Bible actually says. "But now he has obtained a more excellent ministry." Ministry meaning service or liturgy. "He has obtained a more excellent temple service, to the extent that he is also the mediator of a better covenant, or a better priesthood covenant, which has been enacted on better promises." Now, instead of inserting the word covenant in verse 7, which isn't there, read it word for word as per the NASB, omitting the word covenant. "For if that first had been free of fault, no circumstances would have been sought for a second." I would also like to note here that the writer of Hebrews uses a second and not a replacement for. And if we remove the word covenant and replace it with the word priesthood, using the context from the verse before, the flow of the conversation is consistent. There is no sudden change to a completely different subject, and within its own context, the conversation continues to flow flawlessly. So, let's read it with priesthood instead of covenant. "For if that first priesthood had been free of fault, no circumstances would have been sought for a second." The next part, however, does seem to create a little bit of confusion, and rightly so. To the average reader, the following quote from Jeremiah about the new covenant seems to reorient the discussion about the Mosaic covenant and the idea of replacing it. Regardless of how sudden and out of place this change may seem, the implications appear to be on the side of the normative Christian view. And the reason for this is that we know for a fact that Jeremiah 31:31 is not talking about the priesthood covenant. It is speaking explicitly about the new covenant. But another complication arises from this passage being brought up. If we have been trying to justify Yeshua's heavenly priesthood this whole time, why aren't we just trying to cite verses that would support that claim? Or looking for verses in the prophets that would give a prophetic view of this change? One issue is there aren't any verses in the Tanakh, the Hebrew name for Old Testament, a phrase I don't use or agree with, that prophetically state a need for another priesthood. However, the method of exegesis being used here is incredibly consistent with Jewish hermeneutic. The particular method in question, I believe, is drash, which means something like to puzzle together or to connect. Jewish hermeneutics have an acronym for the 4 different types of study typically used in Hebrew thought. The term is called pardes, from pshat, plain or direct meaning, remez, implied or hinted at meaning, drash, the alternate or sought meaning, and sod, the mystical or esoteric meaning. The method of drash is to be comparative and to seek out meanings of the texts by comparing a set of words in similar phrases in other areas that are being used. By connecting the passages together in this way, one can find teachings or meanings to help clarify the passage or extract some other understanding from the text. This method is so standard in Jewish exegesis that entire books have been written and dedicated to exactly this process, the most popular one being the Midrash Rabbah, the word midrash coming from the root word darash, midrash. Now, it's a widespread method of darash to oftentimes ignore the direct context of the passage being cited as a proof text, not to extrapolate something unrelated, but to help drive the point home that the one making the darash is trying to illustrate. Paul used this method very often in his own writings, and atheists love to point out that Paul very often ignores the direct context of the passage he happens to be quoting. But that's not the point of the darash. The point is to set a precedent for the doctrine being formulated by showing that alternate meanings can be applied to similar words or phrases elsewhere in the Bible. This happens to be the case in Hebrews chapter 8 when quoting Jeremiah 31. The writer of Hebrews sets the stage for this darash by using the word covenant before the quote in question, in the context of the priesthood covenant. So for now, The word covenant means priesthood, for the purpose of this drash, and he will now make the connection to the covenant in Jeremiah's prophecy. The Greek here is pretty clear. The writer intends to make this connection with the priesthood by opening the phrase, for finding fault with them. Who is the them in this passage? Well, it would be none other than the Aaronic priesthood we just got done spending several chapters and verses talking about. The primary reason for bringing up the Jeremiah passage is to make the connection that this future better covenant needs a better priesthood to establish it. Simply put, the writer of Hebrews is using Jeremiah as a drash. By connecting the word covenant in the context of the priesthood covenant, he's using the passage to support his argument that Yeshua's heavenly priesthood establishes the new covenant in heaven. Interestingly, the actual context of the Jeremiah passage seems to imply that the new covenant is just the Torah being written on your hearts, that essentially the Torah would be so ingrained in us that nobody would have to teach us what the Torah commands, or to know God. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my Torah into their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. This Jeremiah passage further illustrates the eternality of the Torah. And if the writer of Hebrews is using this as a proof text that the Torah is done away with, he's picked a very poor verse to do so. Perhaps the worst verse to do so. Now, this brings us finally to the verse in question. Hebrews 8:13. We're almost there, I promise. In saying new, he has treated the first as old, but what is being made old and aging is close to vanishing. It's important to note here that the word covenant does not appear in this verse, and the language here is in the future tense. If the old covenant, a phrase never found in the Bible, had been done away at Messiah's death and resurrection, then shouldn't the language here be past tense? The typical Christian thought is when Yeshua said it is finished, well, he was talking about the Mosaic covenant, speaking of the Old Covenant. However, this does not appear to be the belief of the writer of Hebrews. Given the language, it seems that this old thing still seems to be fully in effect at the time of his writing this letter, at least for the time being. However, if we continue to follow the flow of thought, following the drash of Jeremiah with the priesthood, then there's no difficulty here. The earthly priesthood is still in effect, and the only thing that could possibly render it passed away is when the heavenly temple descends in the new heaven and new earth. Here's my amplified version for clarification. In saying new, he has treated the first priesthood as old, but what is being made old and aging is close to vanishing when Messiah returns. But this is a future event that hasn't happened yet, and in the mind of the first century believer, the end times were right around the corner. So it stands to reason that the writer of Hebrews would seem to indicate that this thing is happening very soon. The writer seems to be echoing the words of the Messiah in Matthew 5, verse 18. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or one stroke of a letter will pass away from the Torah until all things are accomplished. Until heaven and earth pass away, the permanent covenant made with Aaron and his priesthood remains, regardless of how soon that might be concluding. In fact, the only reason that covenant would come to a conclusion is because there's no earthly temple in which to serve. The covenant remains totally unbroken, as long as there remains an earthly temple. The Levites are the priests who will serve in it. But if there's no earthly temple, well then there's no need for an earthly priesthood. Unfortunately, the current reality is that there is no standing temple today. Christians have mistakenly thought of this to be a sign that this fulfills the words of Hebrews 8:13, but the promises made to Aaron are still in effect, until heaven and earth pass away, as the Master said. Were a temple to be built soon, the Levitical priesthood would serve in it, as promised. The sacrificial system would continue, and the Jewish people from all over the world would flock to it, especially for the high holy days. This would just keep happening. And in the days of the apostles, they didn't see an issue with this. They didn't see an issue with the sacrificial system at the temple continuing and ongoing. In fact, they instructed Paul himself to offer offerings at the temple to prove that the allegations raised against him were, in fact, false allegations. They even asked him to pay for others to do the same, to further prove that the rumors against him were false. And those false rumors were that he was teaching against Torah. So unless we're to believe that the apostles are caving into peer pressure or being deceitful, these are the same apostles who, in the face of being arrested, refused to give in, openly defied the Sanhedrin's orders, saying in Acts chapter 5, we must obey God rather than men. Given their character and unwavering faith in the Messiah, in the face of death and torture, it seems highly unlikely that they would be giving into peer pressure in this moment, or that they're into the business of deceit. Something worth noting also here is that this event that I'm speaking about in Acts chapter 21, scholars believe happened right around 20 years or so after Jesus' death. So this is well after the transitionary period of the apostles. By this point, the apostles have been believers in the Messiah, studying the scriptures daily at the temple, and have been doing so for longer than many of us have ever been believers. Furthermore, they spent personal time with the Master. So if at any point Yeshua hinted at, or maybe secretly taught, that the offerings would go away at some point in the future, and that they would never have to worry about them again, one would think that by now this teaching would have been made known. But as it stands, the apostles made no such mention. The apostles do not believe this at all. Therefore, they either don't understand the Master's teachings, or the Master never hinted at the abolition of the Torah or the sacrificial system, whether publicly or privately to his disciples. And the conversation about the priesthood doesn't end here, by the way. The subject is continued all the way through chapter 10. So if we just take a step back and look at the whole text from chapter 6 through chapter 10, it wouldn't make sense to suddenly diverge from the subject at hand to have this weird digression about the doing away of the Mosaic covenant. To try and justify the nullifying of the Torah, one would probably need to spend an entire book's worth to justify such a claim, being careful to try and illustrate all of the precedents for it, citing proof texts, carefully explaining the position, much like Christian theologians do today. No writer in the New Testament can ever state that the Torah is done away with without consequence. To say something like that would be grounds for stoning by the Sanhedrin. Any references used as a proof text for this point would need to be carefully scrutinized. Instead of accepting that statement at face value, one should ask, does this statement have enough substance to stand alone as proof of a mass theological change? I believe we have, through this journey, discovered the real meaning of Hebrews chapter 8 by remaining faithful to the text and to the context in which it is found. When taken in its totality, it's clear that the primary subject of the writer of Hebrews is talking about the priesthood, the heavenly priesthood. The writer of Hebrews is trying to deal with how Yeshua can be a priest. Any proof texts or references to covenant are made in reference to the priesthood, the Aaronic covenant, and are used to support the writer's point that the earthly priesthood is inadequate for the heavenly temple. Hebrews 8 was never meant in any way to be utilized as a proof text for the nullification of the Torah, and if it were meant to do so, it does a very poor job of doing it. The earthly temple and its priesthood are a shadow of the heavenly temple and its priesthood, and by looking at the shadow, we can get a glimpse of the substance, which we look forward to seeing every day. May the temple be rebuilt speedily in our days, and may our eyes behold your Messiah, your salvation, and your return to Zion. Shalom.